Is there a strategy that'll help you grow your company faster? CEO Sales Strategies is an investigative business podcast for entrepreneurial people who never stop asking questions. Highly acclaimed sales revenue growth expert Doug C. Brown interviews CEOs, business owners, and professionals who serve them to uncover and share actionable tips and methods behind their bulletproof sales strategies. Topics covered on the show include their failures, struggles, secrets, and processes that help them succeed in selling millions to billions of dollars of their products and services, all with the sole aim of helping you grow your business. If you are eager to know the most effective sales secrets from the A players of the game, then the CEO Sales Strategies podcast is certainly the place to be.
Hey, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast with another episode here, and I have a great guest. His name is Edward Segal. He is a member of Forbes.com and the leadership strategy contributor for them. He's also a very skilled crisis management and public relations and journalist. And the reason I brought him onto the CEO Sales Strategies podcast is because a lot of times companies don't think about crisis management as a revenue growth strategy, but when crisis hits, you really notice the revenue growth drops in many cases, unless it's favorable, like in Zoom or some other type of companies right now that are growing to the pandemic crisis. And he's also the author of 3 books. There's one that's called Crisis Ahead. I'm going to highly recommend you get that. It's all about crisis management and crisis prevention. And how do you actually handle a crisis prior to being a crisis? And once it is a crisis, how do you handle it as well? We're going to touch upon PR, public relations, because a lot of companies, they just don't understand it. And they don't understand the power of the credibility that comes and the recommendations and referrals that will come out of being in the public eye and having, your seat or your stand in front of people, being able to talk about what you do, but getting the credibility from other people. So get notes here, take your pen, take your pencil, get your paper out and write down all the nuggets that come out of this. I think you're going to find some really great ones. We're going to welcome Edward Segal to the call right now. Edward, welcome to the call, sir.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be with you and your audience today.
So here on my birthday, you have a special episode for our listeners. So I think it's special, and here's the reason why. With everything that's been going on in, let's just say the last 12 months, between all of the economic and the COVID and everything else, a lot of people have gone into what I would call a crisis. And a lot of businesses have gone into a crisis. And you specialize in crisis resolution and crisis management and all that good stuff. Do I have that correct?
Yes, and also I specialize in crisis prevention. The best way to deal with a crisis is to not have to deal with a crisis. So it's a combination of preventing, responding, managing, and importantly, recovering from a variety of crisis situations.
Well, that's really an interesting point because, I saw in your book, by the way, folks, he's got a great book. The book is called Crisis Ahead, the 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and other emergencies. And I love what you wrote in the book. There was something when COVID hit, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically the government and many of the companies around the globe, sort of turned their head and didn't really kind of thinking, I hope things will get better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously they didn't. Why do you think people do that? Why do you think they look at it like governments look at this and people look at this and companies and they go, well, we'll just wait it out?
Well, I think part of it is human nature. We are. I think it's in our DNA not to want to deal with a crisis. So for many of us, denial is an important strategy. And trust me, denial as a strategy for dealing with a crisis never, ever works. The best way to help prevent a crisis is to strategize, do scenario playing, make a list of the worst case things that could possibly happen to your company or organization, and find ways to address each one of those issues so you're worst case scenarios don't become a nightmare. And the other thing that's unfortunate is that the longer we wait as a nation, as a culture, as a people, or as individual businesses to deal with a crisis, respond to the crisis, the chances are pretty good that that crisis will get worse. So there's a lot of reasons to be preemptive and proactive and to deal with a crisis as soon as possible.
And everybody seems to have their own definition of a crisis, but you're the expert in this. So what would your definition of a crisis be?
Anything bad that can happen. Okay. It's a very broad definition. that can happen to a company, individual, organization that affects its image or their image, reputation, bottom line, credibility, relations with customers. It's a long list of what can go wrong. And it's also a long list of how a crisis can negatively affect a company, an individual, or an organization.
So is crisis management different from, say, conflict management, or is it one and the same, or is conflict management part of crisis management?
I think it's part of the big crisis management pie, if you will. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice the crisis pie, and the conflict management, avoidance, that's certainly a part of it. I identified in my book, though, more than 100 different crisis triggers, and it literally goes from A to Z. Starting with accidents such as happened to Boeing or car companies, and going all the way down to the worst things at the end of the alphabet. So a crisis is really limited only by your imagination of what could go wrong, and also the realities of what we faced in this year with the pandemic in the last 12 months. No one ever saw this crisis coming. No one ever sees a crisis coming unless, of course, there's something in your company or organization that could cause a crisis and you don't do anything about it. In that case, the crisis becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The longer you delay in dealing with a potential crisis, the more likely it is that it will become a reality.
So this may be a ridiculous comparison, but I always looked at crisis as it's kind of like a tornado. Right? You just don't know when it's going to touch down. If it does touch down, it happens really quickly versus, say, a hurricane, which is also a terrible thing. But usually we have days or weeks notice on a hurricane coming forth. But in a crisis, it seems like kind of boom, like let's go back to COVID for a second. I mean, there were some indicators, but evidently the public wasn't told and people weren't told what to do, or there wasn't anything put into play very quickly. And we sort of just meandered into it. And it's turned out to be not a fun time for a lot of people. My question on this would be, when it comes to business, a lot of people think, well, this is just normal. Things happen in business. They blow up, things go this, they go that. But in reading your book, what I got an indication about was it's just a bunch of decisions, usually precursor decisions that happen that lead to the actual crisis. In many cases, they could see it kind of coming down the line, but they kind of ignored it. Like, that's why I asked the first question, because why, I should probably ask, why is a crisis more prevalent to take down a business than, say, even slower or lack of cash flow or something like that? What about a crisis actually takes down a business? Because this is a business podcast where people are listening and saying, okay, wait a minute, I get it, COVID-19, but what about my business, right? How does a crisis actually impact a business? And could you give a couple of examples?
Well, before the year of the pandemic, it was really unusual for a crisis to take down and destroy any business. And that's one of the unusual, unfortunate things of the pandemic crisis. Hundreds of thousands of companies, small and large, medium, have not just been damaged, they've been destroyed. The work closed for business is not a temporary thing for many of them. It's the end of their business, and they are not going to reopen. And that's why it's important for any company to have the resources to weather any kind of storm. I like your analogy of the tornado because a twister like that, it's unpredictable. Although some comics say that it's interesting how often the tornadoes will hit mobile home parks as opposed to an office building. Maybe that's because the structures are not secured to the ground, and they're more prone to those kind of things. But to answer your question, it's a different reality now. Not the new normal. It is a different reality now for what companies have to face, and they are even though they might have survived the pandemic so far, there's absolutely no guarantee that they'll be able to survive the weeks and months to come. And also, there's no guarantee that the light at the end of the tunnel for this pandemic is not necessarily another oncoming train. Even Dr. Fauci said if we don't continue to do the right things the right way for the right reasons to protect ourselves and our businesses, and with the new variants of COVID-19, it's very possible we might see a resurgence. So my advice to all your listeners and viewers is don't take anything for granted. Have a crisis management plan in place. And just because you have not been destroyed or damaged by this crisis so far doesn't mean you're not at a continued risk for harm, damage, or being destroyed in the future.
So what I'm getting out of that is, okay, we've gone through this. We understand. I'm a restaurant that had 30 locations, right? And all of a sudden, wham, it just, the tornado came through. And now I've had to, lay off 2/3 of my staff. I'm closing locations, et cetera. But I'm not out. I'm not out of business at this point. I'm coming back. The economy's starting to come a little bit more back. We're opening up the communities a little bit more in the United States. What I'm hearing, though, is I should prepare for the crisis ahead far longer than I probably think I should. I should be starting to prepare right now for what might happen 6-12 months from now.
Yes, definitely. You should always have, in business especially, as long of a horizon as you possibly can to see what might be ahead. Now, some crises you might be able to see in front of you. Others are on the horizon, and others are hidden beyond the horizon, and you haven't been able to see them yet. One of the good things, though, about what we're going through now, thanks to Congress and some of our political leaders, is that there are more money, there's more resources, there's more help, whether it's from the bill that President Biden just signed with the COVID relief package or aid or assistance from FEMA. There might be a lot of resources for companies for money, for help, for expertise and guidance, whether it's on a state, local level. There might be resources in your city or your town, depending upon your metropolitan area. So use your imagination, reach out to your friends, family, talk to your consultants, talk to your HR people, talk to your CPA, your financial advisor, and ask them what resources they think might be available to you. You've got to be creative when it comes to imagining the worst possible crisis and being creative to identify and utilize those sources to help you prepare and recover from one.
So I see, I talk to so many businesses, and some of them are just totally in despair. Like they're just down, out. And others are just like, woo, we're like Zoom. This thing just helped us grow like crazy. For those, I can imagine some people listening going, yeah, you know what, but this is just doom and gloom. It's going to continue. And I should just push it to the side. I shouldn't pay attention to this. What would you say to those folks?
Get over it. That's living in a fantasy world. And too many companies lived in the fantasy world for so long. They were in denial. Many of them continue to be in denial about many of the crisis situations that we're dealing with right now. Take the pandemic, for example. We've known for more than a year on how to end it. Social distancing, wearing masks, follow the guidelines from CDC. And it's been a very checkered record of companies and organizations and even states across the country that have followed those guidelines. And even when those guidelines work or start to work, recently more than a dozen states decided, nah, that's okay. We're going to ignore it. We're going to lift our restrictions. We're going to stop doing what has been working to get us out of the pandemic. So that's not a good strategy in any situation. And if you're on the right path to recovery, when you get off that path, all you're doing is prolonging the crisis and making things worse. So don't stop what's working to fix a crisis. And in this pandemic crisis, we all should follow the CDC guidelines. Even if local states are lifting it, do the right thing for yourself, your customers, and your employees, and stay on the right path to recovery.
And I think that's so important for business owners to actually embrace, because I've been teaching for a long time that, massive prospecting will always outsell the master closer in any type of sale. Occasionally the closer will close better, but if the master prospector is constantly going. So I'm advising companies, look, now's the time to put the pedal down and really go after business, because everybody's pulling back at this point. And if you're going to put your head in the sand and wait for the, tide, well, guess what? The tide's going to come in, right? One way or another. The tide always comes in, always goes out. And in your book, you wrote what I've been saying to people, which is, look, this is not the first time we've been through something like this. We've been through Ebola, SARS, MERS, 9/11, the real estate bust. I mean, the tech bubble bust. I remember when that happened in, I think, the late 80s. So there's always going to be something that's happening. How does one kind of project forward as a business owner or a business leader and say, okay, I think these might be my challenge spots that are coming down the line? How do they project forward? Is there a process to it, or is it just sort of like, well, okay, do your best?
No, it's there's a lot of guidance and a lot of advice you could follow. In fact, in my book, I list more than 100 different crisis triggers and dozens of crisis scenarios. And I encourage people to take the test and put yourself in the shoes of a business owner. If this scenario happened to you, what would you do? What would you say? How would you recover? The more you do these role-playing, game-playing scenario tests on a regular basis, the more prepared you are likely to be for any crisis that strikes your company or organization. But also importantly, a lot of companies don't even have a basic crisis management plan. And if they're hit by a crisis, they're going to be running around for quite a while trying to figure out what to do. If you have a crisis management plan in place, even a basic one for your business, you'll be in a much better position to know what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, why you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and a time frame for doing it. And then throughout the year, I always advise my clients to test their crisis management plans with practices and sessions and drills and make sure it works. And if something doesn't work in your plan when you're testing it out, do what's necessary to strengthen it and making sure that it will work when, not if, you have to use it.
We're speaking with Edward Segal, the great author of a book called Crisis Ahead, the 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. And Edward, I think you brought up, I'm going to try to paraphrase this a little bit, because it was an old business lesson that was taught to me from a very successful guy. And he always said, Doug, you have to plan for business today, the business you have today, but you also have to plan for the business you want 3 years from now or 5 years from now. And what I'm hearing, which I've been remiss in doing in some cases, is I should also be preparing not only for the business I want, but I should be preparing for the potential crisis that could actually affect that business 3 years from now. And I should be doing that now, not waiting 2 years and 11 months and finding out, does this make sense, or is this accurate?
No, it's right on target. In fact, I tell people to think about a crisis like a great hockey player, Wayne Gretzky. He was a great all-star player for many years. And someone asked him, how come he was so good? He says, I'm good because I don't hit the puck where it is. I hit it where it's going to be. He moves in position. He positioned his stick. He figured out what the trajectory was going to be. And one of his strategies was to be where the puck was going to be. And that's kind of a great way for businesses to think of a crisis. Don't worry about where you are now and say, I'm off the hook, there's no problems. Worry about what might happen. Strategize, crisis management approaches for different possibilities, role play, and test your ability to respond to those crises. The more prepared you are for a crisis today, the more likely it is you'll be a success in dealing with it tomorrow.
Edward, if somebody wants to get your book or they want to get a hold of you, they're listening to this, they go, man, I got to talk to a guy about crisis management. I mean, you are the expert in the, I'll just say in the world, based on what all my research I'm doing. You are the foremost expert. I mean, the governments reach out to you, businesses reach out to you. How do they get a hold of you, and how would they get your book?
Well, thank you. They can go to my website, which is publicrelations.com. That's publicrelations.com. And I have more information about the book. I have information how they could contact me. I also encourage people to read my regular posts, the stories that I write for Forbes.com. I'm a leadership strategy contributor for Forbes.com, and I update a lot of what I talk about in my book, but I use examples that are in the news right now, interview a lot of people about the crisis, and it's a great way to have a continuing education on how to prepare for, manage, and recover from a crisis. But I welcome if anyone has any questions or wants to talk about my consulting services, reach out to me at publicrelations.com.
So we're going to talk about public relations in a moment, because I was holding that to the end. But but folks, go get the book. The book's a really great book. I've gone through it. It's full of useful information, and I learned a lot from the book. You have something called the 10 R's of crisis management in that book. You want to give an elaboration on what those 10 points are all about?
Well, I boiled down the basics of what business leaders should know about a crisis, how to prevent, prepare, manage, and recover from a crisis. And I boiled it down to what I call the 10 R's of risk management. And some of those R's are risk. What are the risks? What can you do to evaluate the risk, identify the risk? We've talked about some of that already today. Another R is reduce. Once you've identified what those risks are, what can you do now to reduce the chances, mitigate the chances that those risks will become a reality? Rehearse. That's another R. You should always rehearse, do practice and scenario testings and planning to make sure you are prepared for a crisis. And the last R in my 10 R's of crisis management is remember. Remember the lessons if you went through a crisis and what you found out about your ability to respond to a crisis, but also be a continuing student of the crisis situations that other companies and organizations are going through. Remember what they went through, put yourself in their shoes, and if it happened to you, what would you do? How would you react to that crisis? The more you remember and you're a continuing student of crisis management, that's a great way to be prepared for whatever comes down the pike tomorrow.
That reminds me of a time when I was in the military. And in basic training, they used to pull us out at all times of hours, different weather, snow, rain, hail, it didn't really matter. We were out there. And it would be like, okay, take the magazine out of your weapon, clear your weapon. Okay, now put it back in, right? And you have, 5 seconds, right? It was that type of thing. So they would drill us on this one point. And one day I went up to the master sergeant who was training us, and I said, why do we do this like so many times? And he told me this story. He said, when I was in combat one time, I had to walk through, and I found after the combat, we'd walk through the areas, and a lot of times I would find our soldiers who would have the magazine stuffed in backwards into their weapon. And unfortunately, they had no way to defend themselves, so they ended up not making it through. And because running companies myself and things, it's like, there's so much going on, man. How am I going to focus on what potential crisis is going to happen? But the reality is that, folks, you're never going to need it unless you need it. And when you need it and you don't have it, it's not the time to find out. Would you agree with this, Edward?
Oh, yes. You don't want to deal with a crisis and figure out how are you going to deal with a crisis while you're having a crisis. I compare it to building a plane while you're flying a plane. It's
Right.
hard to do everything at once. So be prepared. The more prepared you are, the more drills you do. Just like in your military, in the military, practice with live ammunition if you can. By that I mean, crisis scenarios and what if situations. And the more you're prepared, the better off you're going to be. Another way of being prepared, depending upon the size of your company, is don't wait to appoint a crisis management team to respond to the crisis. Appoint that team now. Make sure they're familiar with the crisis management plan. Have them be responsible for testing the plan throughout the year. And importantly, make sure members of the team are able to work together. If they can't work together well when there's not a crisis, it might be very challenging for them to work together when there is a crisis. So test, exercise, drills on a very regular basis, your plan and your crisis management team.
And that team always has a leader, right? So how important is it? And I think I know the answer, but I really want to get it from the expert. How important is it for a leader to actually build trust with that team and have clear communications when it plays into a crisis?
Well, communications is absolutely essential in any crisis. And if a leader can't communicate effectively, strategically, and efficiently with members of their team, that's just the equivalent of putting one other hands behind the back and make it even more challenging. In a crisis, you need instant, effective, clear communications. Sometimes that communications is with members of your team, your employees, members, your consultants or vendors, the public. And in any crisis, you need as many communication channels open, whether it's email, direct messaging, sending out information on social media, your website, whatever is the best way, the proven way to reach who you have to reach in a crisis. Make sure those tools are working. Use them on a regular basis. And if there's a problem, make sure you have a backup, because communication is absolutely essential in a crisis.
Yeah, without question. I remember when 9/11 happened, that I used to work in the telecommunications industry, and when the World Trade Centers came down, we were one of the only telecommunications companies that actually had service in New York. And I remember the chaos, right? But the fact that we could communicate and move messages around and get information to people was so helpful to people during that time. So wise advice. We're talking with Edward Segal. He's the author of Crisis Ahead. He's also a crisis management consultant and a PR consultant. Very smart guy when it comes to PR. And I've learned this through actually meeting him through PR. And he was the gentleman who was kind enough to get me published in Forbes the first couple of times. And I really am grateful for that, Edward. I really think it's important for companies to understand, okay, we have crisis, but let's shift to PR for a second, because I really think it's very important. For years, no matter what size company, and we've had companies that are, been in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and we didn't use PR, right, at that time. And, we've always subscribed to, okay, well, we could grow a company by just selling, which is true. A lot of companies can. But what I recognize with PR is it makes the selling a lot easier than it was without it. And for those people who are thinking about, well, is PR really a great strategy for my company, whether they're a small company or a large company, what would you say to them?
I'd say remember the difference between publicity and advertising. Advertising, you could say whatever you want to whoever you want, depending upon how much money you have. It's not that way in public relations or publicity. You have to have a story. You have to have something that's interesting and newsworthy. And you have to have a news hook or story angle that will help convince an editor, a reporter, or even a blogger for doing a story about your company, your organization, your product, or your services. Public relations and publicity has something that advertising doesn't have, and that's instant credibility. You can't buy, at least not in this country, you can't buy a good story in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or any other organization. But if you have a story, a news hook, something interesting and newsworthy, and a reporter does a story about it, boom, you have instant credibility and the implied endorsement that you get from a news organization doing a story about your company. So that's an important value. And you're right. People hear about you because of a good story in a news organization. They're more likely to think highly of you, more likely to think you have more credibility than if they just saw an ad. So find ways to be interesting and newsworthy. That's another value that I provide my clients, PR people provide to their clients, to identify the news hooks. We're creative. We look for ways of getting news coverage. And we also try to tie in announcements to what's happening real time in today. So some stories are evergreen, and some you have to take advantage of right away, or by the time you get around to it later, no one will be interested. So don't wait if you have a good story.
I want to get to the process in a second. I think what you said is really important, because a lot of business owners will look and go, "Oh, PR, it's a lot of effort, da da da." But what I want you to think about, folks, is PR works kind of like this. This is what I've discovered: is it's a referral. It's an endorsement from some other credible industry or credible entity that says, "Hey, you know what? In my case, Doug C. Brown, you're credible enough for us." And so I get put into, say, Forbes. Well, people have read that article. They've read the mentions. Or any type of thing. Think of it. I always look at sales, Edward, as like, it's kind of like human relationships, right? You could ask a gal out 50 times and she might say no. But if she talks to her best friend and her best friend tells a great story about me, the next time I ask, she says yes, because that friend provided that huge amount of credibility and trust for that, for her, where she was comfortable enough to say hi and take the risk. And I see the same thing happening with me in my companies with working with PR. And so the point I want to make here is, folks, there's a process to it. And if you don't understand the process on how to do it, what I discovered was you don't really get mentioned a lot. But once you do understand the process and work with guys like Edward, then all of a sudden these doors magically start opening. Edward, could we talk a little bit about the process? Like what, you got to be newsworthy. What does that mean, right? Because I used to think, well, okay, everything's newsworthy, but it's not newsworthy to the media.
Well, I boil it down to two basic questions when I talk to my clients when they want news coverage. They have to answer, or I have to find ways of answering for them if I take them on as a client, two questions. Who cares and why? Who's going to care about your announcement, and why are they going to care? What is the impact? What is the relevance? What does it mean for your target audience? And if you can't answer those two key questions, or if I can't as a PR consultant, then they're not going to get the coverage that they want. But once they do get that coverage, and this is another benefit for publicity, if you have a link to a good story or an interview, you can get, it's almost like eternal life. You can use that link, you can use that story for quite a number of months or sometimes years if it's a good story. And you can include links to that story in all of your marketing efforts, even in your advertising if you want. Make sure it's in your social, you spread the word far and wide on your social media platforms and on your website. So there's a lot of credibility. If you can get that kind of story, that will help move the needle for your company. But just don't look at it as a one-time thing. Use it over and over again. And frankly, the more stories that you're able to generate, the more you can, it will compound and feed on itself. And then finally, another great reason to get just one good story is a lot of reporters will look for good people to interview who've already had stories done about them. So whenever you have the opportunity to be interviewed by a reporter, consider it almost like an audition tape. If you do well and you get a story from that reporter, other reporters might see that story and find a reason to work you into their stories. So there's a lot of reasons to be doing good PR and a lot of ways to take advantage of the coverage when you're able to get it.
And I think that's a really great point because I found that, right? Once you kind of break in and you get something that's decent, then other reporters tend to be far more open to placing my story in other places or a different version of the story or something of that nature. So it's very, when you're first doing PR, what I discovered was it takes a little bit of time, and a lot of people don't look long term with PR. They look at it as, oh, well, I just made a cold call and this person said yes or no to me, so that's the end of the relationship one way or another. We're going to begin and we're going to end. But what I found with PR is that PR is a long-term strategy. Can you speak to that? Because I know a lot of people, especially the type drivers who run businesses are like, well, we got to get things done today. But it's a long-term play. And as you said, the more you toot your own horn and blow your, but have the orchestra blowing behind, the more people actually go, wow, this person let's elevate their status. That's what I've noticed happen with me with PR when we really started putting it in play.
Yes, don't wait to start thinking about PR. And once you start thinking about it, don't wait to do something about it. The sooner you start working with your staff or you reach out to a PR consultant like me, the sooner we could start working with you to help strategize what's interesting, what's newsworthy, what's coming down the pike that we might be able to turn into a news story. Timing is very iffy in public relations. Sometimes there's just so much happening in the news, such as what happened after 9/11 or the early days of the pandemic. Many news organizations may not have any interest at all in doing anything other than what's topical and on the front pages that day. The challenge is if you have something you want to generate publicity for in that news cycle, you have to find a way of associating your announcement with what's happening in that news cycle. The other thing I advise clients is that there's two kinds of public relations. There's the proactive, when we're pushing out a story that we want reporters to cover, and there's the reactive, when reporters reach out to you for comments or observations or analysis on stories that they're working on. So you really need to have, or your PR firm needs to have, good working relationships with a lot of different editors and reporters, and position your company or organization as a resource to the media so that they know when they're looking for a story idea or they're looking for someone to comment a story on that they're working on, they know how to reach you, they know you have the credibility, and that's another great way to help ensure success in generating publicity for your company.
I'm just going to state it for the record. If you don't know how to do this, hire somebody like Edward. Go to get a PR firm, because it's short money, long money, right? So if I'm sure that we could all repair the sink, when it leaks, right? But I remember, one time I was doing that and it took me like all day and I couldn't figure out how to do this. There was some special nut on the thing. And I was like, so I go to Home Depot, I'd come back, I'd go to Lowe's, I'd go to the Ace Hardware, I'd try to figure this thing out because, I didn't really want to hire a plumber at that point. It was just a time in my life where I didn't have the cash and I was like, I just don't want to hire this plumber. So I go out and I try to repair this thing and I didn't get it repaired. It took me like 6 hours and I'm like, finally, I call a plumber. Plumber comes in, he goes, oh yeah, that's easy. Tighten, fix. Leak stopped. That'll be $75, Doug. And I was like, you kidding me? I just spent a whole day for $75, right? I find that PR is the same way. If you don't have the relationships, if you don't know the path, you don't know it, hire somebody like Edward to at least take you through the path so that if you want to stay long-term, great. If not, at least you'll know what you're doing. Because if you don't, I just did this this week it came up, Edward. You probably laugh at this one. So I found that HEB was, having challenges. Their clients were leaving HEB because of the COVID mask policy. They were like, oh, you don't need a mask or whatever they were doing. And I looked at that and I said, geez, this is a great business lesson for people. So I wrote something up last week and I was like, okay, we'll release it this week. Well, guess what? HEB reversed their policy on the mask thing, right? But that's what he's talking about. That's what Edward's talking about on the timely nature. And if you don't have the relationships to get it into the timely nature, or you just don't take action on the timely nature, in my case, that's what I did, then, your newsworthy story is no longer newsworthy potentially to the media at that time. So hire a professional like him and, invest, even if it's a few months, learn the path. And from there, you'll figure out whether or not you want to, continue to have somebody do it for you, or, you can do some of it yourself. That is what I would recommend to everybody listening here today. Edward, do you have a different thought process on this, or would you be in agreement with that?
No, I and other PR professionals, we know the tools of the trade. We know what works. We know what doesn't work. And part of the challenges we often have in dealing with our clients is to help educate them about the realities of public relations, how much it takes, how you need to be prepared, and importantly, how to talk to editors and reporters when you have an opportunity to be interviewed for that story. That's another service I provide for my clients is media training. I walk them through mock interviews. I play the reporter, they play the client. I ask them questions as if I was interviewing them for a major news organization. And it's really interesting how well and sometimes how poorly top company officials do when they're under the gun, even in a mock interview situation, to be able to explain in basic newsworthy terms who they are, what they do, what their product does, what their service is, those kinds of things. So that's something else I bring to the table is media training, crisis management, and making sure that when my clients do have the opportunity to be interviewed with reporters, they're as ready as possible for that opportunity. Because if you blow it when you're talking to a reporter, that's your only chance with them. And if it's a recorded or broadcast live interview and other people see how poorly you did, that's going to be a ding against you and can make it harder for you to have other interview opportunities. So be prepared as you can to deal with the media, and that's another service I provide to my clients.
Very wise advice, and I'm backing this up from somebody who's done it the opposite way and then done it the way he's talking about. So, Edward, I want to thank you, sir, for being on here. Again, we're talking with Edward Segal. He wrote a book called Crisis Ahead. He's also a crisis management consultant as well as a PR consultant. And reach out to him. I think you said it was publicrelations.com was the website. And yes, we'll post all this into the show notes, folks, for you. So it comes to that time, Edward, I want to ask, I always ask this question at the end. Who's one of your heroes in life, or one or two of the heroes in life that have actually propelled you to where you are so that you can take care of all these companies and, do great things for them?
Well, I'm a great student of history, and I really enjoy studying historical figures to see what they did when they were under the gun and how they respond to and managed and recovered from a crisis. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a great book a couple years ago, Leadership, Lessons to be Learned from people like Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman. And I study these people a lot because I learned a lot from how well and sometimes the challenges that they had and how poorly they did in meeting these challenges. But I always like to look at new people to study. I'm a continuing education student. I'm always looking and studying to see how well and poorly other business leaders and heads of organizations are doing now. So I never stop learning about crisis management. And I urge your listeners and viewers, start learning and never stop. The more prepared you are, the more likely it is you'll be able to do a better job preventing, managing, responding, and recovering from a crisis.
Well said, sir. So, Edward, thank you for being here. I really am grateful you're here. I know people got a lot out of this episode. And, folks, go buy the book, Crisis Ahead. Reach out to him at publicrelations.com if you have any questions on crisis management or PR. The gentleman can help you. So, Edward, I'm going to bid you a wonderful day, sir. Thank you for being here. It's been a true pleasure.
It was great to be with you, Doug, and happy birthday.
Thank you. Okay, this is Doug C. Brown, and let's think about this for a second. what is crisis really, right? Crisis is one of those things that it can be small or large, but it's a crisis. It actually negatively affects us in a major way, usually. Even if it's a small crisis, it could be something that could affect you in a major way. I mean, I just had a pet of mine die, and, my cat. And unfortunately, that was a crisis. And I didn't realize how much it was going to affect me, but it really did. And it actually, took my brain down to probably 50% power for at least a week. So you can have a small crisis, and, that could be magnified, or you could have this large crisis of, hey, guess what? You know what? I don't have clients coming in my doors anymore because of the pandemic, or because something leaked out about my CEO. And it's not favorable. And, we got challenges. It could be a key division leaves the company for whatever reason. There's all kinds of things that happen where we think oh my gosh, they're really bad and we can't necessarily recover from it. And the reason for that is we don't have a process. So Edward clearly describes his process throughout the book that he wrote called Crisis Ahead. And that's why I recommend it highly. And so if you're going to build a business, you want to build the business for today, but you also want to build the business that you want in 3 to 5 years, because that's what you will get. So part of that needs to be, crisis mitigation or management of the process. PR, public relations, is so important to a company. And I got to admit, I kind of put this down for a long time, and I'm like, I don't really need PR. And then all of a sudden I just started thinking, well, let's give it a shot. And it took a while. So those of you who are going to do PR, I recommend you hire somebody that can walk you through the ropes, like Edward. And just for those who are asking, is Edward, the guy that I hired originally? No, he's not. He's a guy I met because I actually did this. But PR is the best credibility and referral system that you probably can get if you work it correctly. PR will bring you business in ways that you just didn't think, because, how do I say this? Someone else's word is more important than yours, really, when it comes down to it in the public eye. And that's what I learned through PR. So, take what you learned from this podcast today, put it into play, and please, 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 please put it into play, right? Because hearing information, knowledge is not power, it's potential power. Action is the real power. So take what you learned from today, put one action item in play. If you like this podcast, please go up and give it a 5-star review as always. And, share with me your comments, your questions, what you'd like to see on future episodes. And I'll be happy to cover them, because this is for you, even though I get to do it. So thanks for allowing me to do so. Again, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategy Podcast. Until next time, go out, sell a lot of good stuff, grow your revenues, and to your success.